you everyone for joining us again for the next session. We will continue this webinar by sharing data and experiences from other countries on mobility and transportation. The session will be chaired by Associate Professor Dr. Davinda Kaur from University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Please welcome Associate Professor Dr. Davinda.
Good morning and salam sejahtera. I'm Associate Professor Dr. Davinda from Center for Healthy Aging and Wellness, Aged Care, Faculty of Health Sciences, University Kebangsaan Malaysia, and I will be moderating this session. We are very honored this morning to have Prof. Dr. Helena Titterage from University of London as one of our international speakers this morning. Prof. Dr. Helena Titterage is a professor of mobility and sustainable transport at UCL. She has over 25 years of research experience in the areas of travel behavior, transport planning, sustainability, and the built environment, and has been involved in a wide range of funded research projects, including several related to improving the accessibility of transport systems for disadvantaged groups, including older people. Prof. Dr. Helena has recently worked with the UK Department for Transport considering the implications of an aging population for future transport policy. Without much delay, let's welcome Prof. Dr. Helena Titterage for her presentation on development of accessible transportation indicators. Welcome, Prof. Dr. Helena.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. Let me just make sure I've got my screen shared. Great, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to present. I wanted to talk to you today about some work that I've been doing over the last 15 years, which relates to the development of accessibility indicators. And I just wanted to, my computer's just frozen for a minute. Let me just. Get the presentation up. That's better. Okay. So yeah, I'll have a brief introduction and talk about sort of what I mean by accessibility and accessibility indicators. Then talk about two projects that I've been involved in before moving on to looking at what are the next developments that are needed in the UK with regards to accessibility indicators for older people before drawing some conclusions. So what is accessibility? Well, essentially, what I mean by accessibility is about reaching the ease with which people can reach places, with which they can access services and facilities that they need to reach and that they desire to reach. So accessibility, I'm acknowledging that accessibility is multidimensional. It works across multi-scales. So there are macroscopic and microscopic elements that contribute to that. And very much that it's subjective. That because of that term, the ease with which we reach, it comes down to how different people experience, how they perceive that ease of movement. And that makes developing accessibility indicators that are meaningful all the more difficult. We know from our research.
Prof. Helena, please can you share your slides on presentation, because it's still on the slideshow and it's not moving.
It's okay, the wrong screen showing. Let me just...
I think you need to reshare. Just stop sharing and reshare.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so so essentially trying to capture those needs of older people can be quite difficult. Most accessibility indicators are place-based rather than people-focused, that are used across sort of transport planning at the moment, and they tend to concentrate on dominant or easy to model transport modes such as the car, increasingly public transport, and a little bit of walking. Very few are truly multimodal. Most focus on weekday peak hour travel and use relatively simple measures of impedance to travel, such as distance or travel time. And there's multiple reasons behind that. One is that those sort of measures require minimal amounts of data. They require easy to use data. Sometimes it's a lack of understanding of what really needs to be measured. And sometimes it's about using indicators that are sort of off the shelf, that are ready to come by. But that can be dangerous because it means that we can be using those indicators. We may miss identifying where there are problems. We might identify places where there are no problems of having problems, and we may end up developing solutions, interventions that don't really tackle the core issues. But of course, accessibility indicators are really important when it comes to sort of justifying investment in infrastructure, because we need those objective measures, and you can already see there's a mismatch between objective and subjective there, and to quantify the benefits of those interventions. So it's worth making the effort to sort of develop accessibility measures that at least try and incorporate some of the features that are meaningful to older people. This table just shows and tries to illustrate some of that. You can see here that transport planners tend to view sort of time and cost as important. The types of destinations that get emphasis. This isn't just for older people, this is across the board: employment and health and food. And an emphasis on congestion or public transport running to timetable. Our work with older people has suggested that actually, this is older people in England, and relatively small groups, so we have to be careful generalising here. But the groups we've talked to, travel time wasn't seen as particularly important. They were retired. They had quite a lot of freedom to choose how long they offers concessionary fare schemes. Journey cost wasn't hugely important. And they were more concerned about just being able to get out and about and to get to see family and friends, to do social activity levels. We heard that was relevant for Malaysia as well in an earlier presentation.
So, sorry to interrupt, Ada.
That's okay.
Your screen is still frozen just now. So I think, yeah, I think you need to stop share and reshare.
Yes, it does seem to have stopped frozen. Let's try again.
Do you want us to share the presentation slides?
That might be easier. I thought it would be easier for me, but
Yeah, let's try this one first. Yeah, yeah, it still froze.
yeah.
Do you want us to share the screen of your slides?
Let me just try one more
Yeah.
time and see if this. No, it's still frozen, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Yeah,
So it's changing on one view, but not on the other. So yes, please, if you would.
all right, we take over. All right.
Okay, and I was on slide 4.
Is it previous or next? Previous.
That's it. Yeah. Great. Okay, so sorry about that, everybody. Yeah, so what you can see here is there are quite a lot of differences between what older people told us was important to them and how transport planners often view accessibility in general and for older people in particular. And the data on transport planners' views was taken from analysis of transport planning documents and local transport plans in the UK. And we can see for accessibility indicators, they tend to include travel time. They rarely include cost because of difficulties in getting the right sorts of data, and rarely include any physical barriers or measures of reliability. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to just talk briefly about 2 projects that I've been involved with that were trying to create measures of accessibility that reflected the experience of different socially disadvantaged groups. First project, SAMP, we used mixed methods approach. So we started with a series of focus groups in 2 places in England, Keighley in West Yorkshire and the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. We also did a survey of passengers on public transport, and we then followed that up with interviews with selected respondents and a further set of focus groups. Next slide, please. Okay, so essentially from the focus groups, the main concerns that the different groups mentioned, including the groups of older people, were gradients, so difficulty walking up and down steep hills, difficulty crossing busy roads where there wasn't a pedestrian crossing, and particularly those without signalised crossing, and bus stop conditions. So quite a lot of bus stops, particularly in Keighley, had no shelter or no seating. And then there were also concerns about lighting levels at night along routes to the bus stops. We conducted a survey where we asked people questions about their preferences and the trade-offs that they would make. So how far would they go out of their way when walking to the bus stop to avoid a steep hill or to avoid crossing a busy road, to avoid a poorly lit quiet road. This enabled us to calculate sort of a weighting or a penalty for each link within the area we were studying, with respect to its terrain, crossing facilities and lighting. And we also did this also with respect to bus stop facilities as well. We then modelled access to bus stops using the shortest path algorithm. And we modelled this along the footway, not the road centre line, so that we had crossings properly accounted for in our analysis. And we used a 5-minute radius because that's what the respondents to the survey told us was an acceptable distance to walk to a bus stop. So this is not on this graphic, the green line that you can just see at the edges of each of the sort of networks is how far you can walk within 5 minutes of the bus stop. And we also use different walking speeds, as you know, for different types of people, different groups of people. And then you can see how much that shrinks as you start to take into account sort of the fact that there aren't any crossings, and even further to the sort of red bit of the network where there are, which is how far it would be acceptable to walk to the bus stop at night. We validated this by going back to the groups, the focus groups that we talked to initially, and asked them if they felt that these maps represented their access to these bus stops and how far sort of they'd be willing to walk. And generally they said that this way of doing things better reflected their experiences and perceptions than just using a very standard 5-minute walking network. The second project that I wanted to draw on today is the ANSU project, Accessibility and User Needs in Transport for Sustainable Urban Environments. And again, this was around measuring accessibility within the context of social exclusion. Within this project, we started by asking people through a series of focus groups basically where people would like to go and how often. And they told us that they would like to go to be able to go food shopping twice a week, comparison shopping twice a month, do social recreational activities twice a week, visit friends and family once a week, and go on holiday twice a year, for example. We tested this with a number of different different focus groups across all different ranges of older people, so we know that there was a reasonable consistency. But one of the things that came out very strongly was that people wanted to be able to do this travel with reasonable ease. So that goes back to our definition of accessibility, where it's about ease of travel. We then began to think about how do we actually measure this, whether somebody can actually reach food shop reasonably easily with so many times a week. We took St Albans as our case study, and we started by mapping all the micro-scale features in St Albans town centre. This was based very much on government guidance about sort of what features constituted accessible urban areas. So things like level paving, no steps, no uneven surfaces, no barriers such as poster boards in the way, raised platforms at bus stops, etc. So we and looked at footway widths as well. So we made a note of all of those features, mapped them within a GIS. And then we took those to a focus group made up of older people and people one younger person who had some various disabilities. We met with that focus group 4 times over a series of period of about 6 months. In the first session, we presented sort of just the barriers to them and discussed access problems. We went through 3 imaginary journeys with them using the maps and using photos, asking them about what route choices they would take to get from the bus stops to popular places within the town centre, to get a sense of were there any types of barriers that we've missed? What were people's preferences in terms of compromise where there was something that they didn't like? So we found that there was a particular street that people avoided during the day because it had lots of tables and chairs out on the street that made it difficult for them to navigate. And there were other streets they avoided at night because there were lots of young people standing around on the street. We also asked them about sort of what changes they thought would be most helpful, and we took that away and modelled that within a GIS system. Next slide, please. And so what we ended up with, so can you skip ahead 2 slides, please? I've forgotten to say next slide to you a couple of times. And 1 more, 2 more, sorry. This one, yes, that's it, thank you. Yeah, so essentially from this modelling and through talking to these focus groups and doing the accessibility modelling in combination with the focus group work, what we came up with that one of the sort of best ways which we could improve the accessibility of St Albans Town Centre was providing more places for pedestrians to stop and rest. So a lot more benches, seats sort of along the footway. That had far the biggest impact on accessibility than putting in more pedestrian crossings, for example, widening some pavements, changing cobbled pavements for something that looked a little flatter and more even. And with the agreement of the focus group, we collated all of this information and presented it to the local authority with the attempt to sort of influence their plans for improving accessibility in the town centre. We've since used this technique a couple of other times to make recommended changes to areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking forward, so to date, a lot of our work has focused on physical barriers, the very tangible things, but we know that there are a lot of temporary features and a lot of less physical sort of barriers to travel amongst older people. And those are changing and the needs of older people are changing. So some of the things that I'm working on at the moment, for example, we know that over the next sort of 20 years in England, we expect older people to be working longer into older age. And I noticed that was something came up in one of the earlier presentations. And that's partly around income and falling levels of income in older age. And partly because people are healthier, so they have a chance to work longer. But some people are also participating in voluntary work, so working in charity shops, things like that, and others are helping out their families with childcare, so taking children to from school. So we think that the number of older people that are travelling during peak hours during the week is likely to increase. And those are the public transport services that are most overcrowded. So an issue I've started looking at with one of my students is around how do we incorporate overcrowding into accessibility measures, and how do we, and getting that sense of how much crowding is too crowded for different groups of people, different people. Because that work's been disrupted at the moment because of COVID, which has had a huge effect on how we think about crowding on public transport. So it remains to be seen whether that has lasting effects. Affordability is a big thing across the board with regards to older people and travel. And that's another one that I'm hoping to work on. And then there's changing health outcomes as well. So we're expecting increasing numbers of people with problems like dementia in the UK. And that has implications for how we provide information and for wayfinding. So I did some work last year with one of my students where we looked at a different way of looking at information, using street audits to provide a sort of accessibility and navigation score for each link along a network, and aggregating that to look at sort of how easy it is to move around the urban area. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know this is a very more details. Please do get in touch if you want more. So essentially, I think what I've been trying to say is that accessibility indicators are incredibly useful, and they're needed because of that need to quantify sort of the impacts of interventions. But we have to use them with care, because they will only ever capture a small fraction of what makes activities inaccessible. But there are advances being made to improve these measures, and there's still much more that we can do, can be done to capture the needs and experience of older people in accessibility measures. And it's likely to need a suite of very different types of measures to catch different types of effects and impacts on accessibility, and must always be used, I think, in combination with talking to older people and getting their experiences, because their experiences are clearly context specific and very individual. Okay, so that's it from me. Thank you for listening, and sorry that it didn't go quite as smoothly as I'd hoped there because of the slide problems.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Halina Titrich, for giving us a portrait of the accessible transportation indicators. Before we continue, I would like to remind everyone that you may type your questions in the chat box that would be addressed by our international speakers in the chat box or later if time permits. Next, we have a team of researchers from UK as well to share their research and perspective from UK. So the first speaker is Dr. Charles Musselwhite. He is an associate professor in gerontology at the Center for Innovative Aging at Swansea University. He has particular interest in improving public policy and practice around built environment and transportation, taking into account an aging population requiring sustainable and environmental contexts, including road user safeties in later life, giving up driving, and creating age-friendly neighborhoods and communities. He has worked on 36 projects as a primary investigator and co-investigator, totaling about £14 million research income, and have authored 38 peer-reviewed journal articles, 18 book chapters, and 4 books in this topic. His presentation will be comprehended by Dr. Amy Murray. Dr. Amy is a research assistant within the Center of Aging and Dementia Research Center for Innovative Aging. Her PhD explored the process of driving cessation in later life amongst older adults and their informal support network members. Finally, we'll have Dr. Ian Scholgel. Dr. Ian has been involved with Center for Transport and Society at UWE since 2007, working on a range of projects over that time. Most of it has been related to three key themes: older people and transport, rural transport issues and technology and transport, often in conjunction and always with a consideration for the wider sustainability context. So without much delay, let's welcome Dr. Musselwhite, Dr. Ian, and Dr. Amy.
Hello everyone, thank you for having us here for the talk today. My name is Charles Musselwhite. I'm an Associate Professor in Gerontology at Swansea University, and I've got a background and interest in transport as we age. Delighted to be here today, albeit on video for you, along with Amy Murray from Swansea University and Ian Shergold from the University of West of England. I was just going to share with you, to begin with, some of my research into the theories, the models and perspectives of older people and transport, to set a context for, hopefully, for your research and for the talk today. So just going to move on to the next few slides. So as a society, we're aging and we're traveling more, but then I want to show you how important mobility is beyond just getting from A to B, what else mobility might be important for than just what we think it might be, some alternatives and how we need to improve those before moving on to thinking about how mobility doesn't even need to be about moving itself. So probably, as you're already very aware, we live in an aging society. We're all living a lot longer than ever before across the globe, whether we're in developed countries or developing countries, low to middle income countries or high income countries. We're all aging, and that's growing more and more all the time. We're becoming a greater proportion of the population as we age as well. As we age, you know, unsurprisingly, though I think it always is important to share, the desire to get out and about doesn't change as we age, nor does the variety of activities that we want to do. In fact, they might even increase. You know, it's really important that we stay active, that we stay mobile, stay connected to the things we want to do. We know that people who are less mobile face problems with depression, feelings of stress, isolation, loneliness, even increased mortality. Here in the Western world, we know particularly older people that have to give up driving have a particular problem when they try and stay mobile later on in life. Overall, we call it a major life event. There's even some research to suggest that it increases or brings forward mortality when we have to reduce our mobility in later. So very important we keep connected to things we want to do and we keep active and mobile. One of the early pieces of research I did was really just to show how important mobility is, not just in terms of getting from A to B, but also beyond that. Lots of the research out there tells us how important getting out and about is so that we can go to services, shops, hospitals, healthcare, stay connected to our friends and family, stay connected to our neighborhoods, and do that as safely, reliably, and cheaply as possible. And that's very important. You know, I'm not diminishing that in any shape or form. That's the underpinning element of this model at the bottom level. However, when I've worked with older people, there's another two levels that reveal themselves as being important to people's travel and mobility needs. There's something we've called social and affective needs. So that's how mobility gives yourself a sense of independence to do what you want to do, a sense of control. A sense of being seen as normal. High mobility levels are normal in our society. If you're sitting at home all day, that doesn't feel right. We've all faced that during various lockdowns across the world over the last year or so. It helps people with their roles in society, whether that's helping family, whether it's giving people lifts, whether it's being able to get out and about and connect to the things that you want to do that give you a role and identity in society, that kind of thing. Finally, there's a top level of needs as well. You know, transport and travel give you an opportunity just to see the world out there, just to see life going on around you. Also, it helps you test cognitive skills. You know, how well are you getting on? How well are you doing? That kind of thing. And we know when people give up driving in the UK, at least, that the bottom level of needs are much harder to be met. So more difficult to go shopping, more difficult to get to healthcare, but they can be met, albeit more difficultly. Somebody might give you a lift, as in the quote here. Somebody might be able to help you begin to use public transport again. There might even be things accessible by foot. What's more difficult and becomes more problematic is meeting the secondary or the tertiary mobility needs, for your social needs, your aesthetic needs. It really feels like people don't belong anymore. These quotes, you know, ready for the scrap heap now when they've given up driving. How they can move to different types of mobility and be able to see beyond that is really difficult. So things just got worse and worse, you know, for people not being able to drive where they want to and go where they want to do it. Teresa Scott and myself did a model in Australia where we looked at different levels of capital that people have that develop and turn themselves into older people's mobility and capital, which therefore help people be mobile. What comes out time and time again is very important is the infrastructure, so the finance, the physical stuff, the roads, the vehicles themselves. You've got to have those in place in order for people to be mobile. But we mustn't forget the things that underpin those and sometimes directly relate to the individual themselves. So the social capital, the fact that there's norms out there in society, that there's families and friends that might support you, the social side of keeping the transport together. And that also affects what infrastructure there might be available to people. There's also the cultural capital, the expectations, the norms, the laws, the rules, the strategies that are out there in terms of culture and what's expected in society. Is it normal to own a car? Is it more expected that you might walk? That kind of thing. And they all come together, and how the individual sort of responds to those is very much how much capital they've got themselves. So their own resilience, their own skills, their own health, their own ability to be able to use the infrastructure, the social and the cultural capital. That all affects how mobile people are. I also wanted to just make sure people think that transport isn't just about getting from A to B to satisfy those very utilitarian needs, that we can move beyond thinking about just going to healthcare, just going to the shops, that kind of thing, that people think about the leisure side of activity. For example, they want to be mobile so they can go to have a coffee or to see other people. And as I said earlier, sometimes the journey itself is what we might call discretionary, that you might drive past the forest or the trees to see the ocean. Perhaps it's the journey itself. You know, you just need to get out there and see the world going on, see other people enjoying themselves, that third space idea. And I like this quote, you know, that the car in particular takes people where you don't need to go. And that, for that person interviewed there, was life. You know, everything else is a bit more fixed and stuck to routines. The car takes you where you don't need to go, and that makes a big difference. Another thing I wanted to think about is just if we think about giving people alternatives to the car, encouraging people out their car in later life, whether they have to or whether that happens as a necessity, is that we need to provide age-friendly transport system beyond that, whether that's good walking and cycling areas, whether that's good public or community transport, but also overpinning that proper policy and plans that enable that to happen. Look at the scenes we have in our built environment. If you want to go walking and cycling, Kuala Lumpur, London, doesn't make any difference. It's all difficult when you're trying to access those spaces on foot and competing with, you know, fast or busy vehicle traffic. Not a great place to be if you're frail, if you've got mobility issues, difficult eyesight, cognition issues, as you might have in later life. We've got to reinvent that walking space. Let's try and make it both functional, so you've got accessibility, but also make it attractive and desirable, moving from the functional to the fun. Let's make it a nice, interesting place that people want to go on foot and want to be part of. And just to finally mention that sometimes mobility isn't just about literal mobility. We often think that when mobility is reduced in later life, we need to think about other ways of achieving more literal mobility. But of course, that isn't always the case. We can think of mobility in different terms. We can think of mobility in terms of what there might be out there. So the potential for mobility, you know, is there a bus that people are able to get on outside their home? What potential is there to go for a walk in your local area? How do we maximize those potentials for people? Also, there's the virtual mobility. So, you know, bringing the mobility to the person. So bringing shopping home, keeping people connected to the world out there on Zoom, on Skype, keeping people connected to family and friends that way. Maybe having online chats, maybe having, you know, windows on the world. So you have webcams and the like linked to places people want to do. And maybe it's all right just to stay at home, just to think about the mobility that people had. Lots of people I interview talk about having been very highly mobile in their life, and they're happy to be at home now. They're done roaming, they want to be at home, they want to sit back and you know, happy to discuss the mobility they've had in their life, but now is a time to be closer to home, to be closer in the neighborhood rather than getting out and about and the stress of mobility. So just thinking about different types of mobility is important. So overall, I want to conclude by saying, don't forget, transport mobility at the end of the day is about people. Travel has affective and psychosocial aspects. It isn't just about practically going from A to B. Provision of mobility beyond the car must recognize that sort of more psychological, more sociological aspect of mobility, and I don't think it often does. Alternatives must be desirable and attractive, as well as being functional. We need to move beyond just the very practical level of things and think about how we pull people to using alternative modes to the car. And finally, what's so special about literal mobility in a car? Can it ever be replaced by different modes? Are we always going to be in deficit because we can't literally be mobile or can't literally use a car anymore? We need to think about what's so special, what's so precious about those types of mobility and that type of vehicle, and try and replicate it in different ways. And that's where I want to end this presentation. Thank you very much. Do any questions, any thoughts or reflections, do contact me on my email there below. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Dr. Amy Murray and I'm a research officer at the Centre for Aging and Dementia Research, Swansea University. I work alongside Dr. Charles Musselwhite, and I know that we're presenting today with another colleague of ours at the University of the West of England, Dr. Ian Shergold. So I would like to talk to you today about driving cessation and informal support. Now, before we actually go in and have a look at driving cessation specifically and then informal support as an alternative to giving up driving, I just wanted to outline some background points. So as we all know, we do have an aging population, and that goes for a global, that is a global phenomena. That's not just something which is specific to the UK. So what an aging population means is that we have a fitter, more active cohort of older people than ever before. This has resulted in an increased number of mobility and therefore transport needs. So older people have more reasons and more needs then to actually get outdoors, to get outside of the house and to meet the high level of mobility needs that they need. Now, when we're looking at driving in later life and why it is so common and so popular amongst older people, this is due to a number of reasons. So why we have an increased number of older drivers is because research has shown that the car is the most comfortable and safest mode of transport. Driving in later life also provides convenience and a level of spontaneity. So if you're an older adult and perhaps on one particular day you feel like getting in your car and going down to the seaside, you're able to do that. On another day, if you feel like staying indoors, you're able to do that. So it's about having choice. It's about being in control of when you want to leave the house. Driving also provides really high levels of independence and personal autonomy. So it's being able to rely on yourself to meet your own level of needs. Driving in later life is also linked to self-identity and status. So being an older driver forms part of who you are. Having a particular car forms part of your identity, and that becomes even more important as we get older. And I've already kind of elaborated on this previously, but driving also allows older people to meet their personal needs, hobbies and interests. So like I said, if somebody wants to perhaps go to a restaurant or to go and play bingo or to go and see family and friends. They're able to just get in the car that's outside their home, jump in and drive to wherever it is that they need to go. However, when we get older, there are a number of inevitable physiological changes which often accompany the aging process. So things such as deteriorating eyesight, hearing, range of motion and muscle strength. They all make the driving task extremely difficult. So what this actually results in is an increasing number of people when they get older having no other option than giving up driving. As well as those personal kind of health issues that old people often experience, there are wider individual societal factors as well. Things such as pressure from other road users and even pressure from family and friends if they think an older person is not safe to be driving anymore. Unfortunately, when somebody gives up driving, this does have very similar outcomes to when you lose a loved one, so bereavement, relocation. So sometimes when some people get older, that is often into residential care or a care home, and also to retirement from the workplace. So driving cessation really is a major later life transition. Now, the outcomes of driving cessation, there are a few positive outcomes, but on the whole, these are primarily negative. So older people often become depressed, lonely, and isolated when they give up the car, and the amount of out-of-home activities that they normally do are greatly reduced. Now, when we're looking at alternatives to driving in later life, there are a number of other modes of transport that older people can and do utilise to meet their mobility needs. So in the UK, things such as public transport, so the bus, usage of the train, the tram and the tube, obviously that is more popular then in inner city, bigger cities in the UK, such as London or Manchester. Older people also utilise lifts from other people, so what we call informal support. They also can undertake active travel, so walking to meet their needs and cycling. They also use private transport, such as taxis, and there's also something in the UK called community transport. So, for example, it may be a minibus that will pick up several people in an area to take them to one shared space. So it may be a hospital, for example. However, the reason I've highlighted lifts from others there in yellow is because that is what I'm going to talk about today. Informal support is the most popular alternative to driving in later life, and there's a number of reasons for this. So older people tell us that informal support and lifts from others is really popular and the most popular as an alternative to driving themselves because it provides a personalised level of transport. It also provides social contact and company for older people. So if they have a lift with a family member or a friend or a neighbour, it creates an opportunity for social engagement, to have a conversation and to have a chat. A lot of older people also have poor experiences of public transport. So they may have bad experiences of using the bus or the train, such as falling, such as an irregular service, and not having regular buses, for example, and other things such as problems carrying heavy shopping on and off public transport. The expense of private transport, such as taxis, also creates another barrier when we're looking at taxis and alternative to driving. And when we're on about active travel, walking and cycling, a high number of older people have poor mobility and health. So what that actually means is that they're not able to walk very far, and many older people are actually completely unable to cycle because of the mobility problems that they have. And when we're referring to community transport, there's often a stigma associated with that. So many older people decide that community transport isn't an alternative at all to them actually driving the car previously. So when we're looking at informal support as an alternative to driving in later life, there are a number of positive outcomes that older people refer to. So as I've just alluded to, when you have a lift with somebody that you know that is normally within your own social network, your informal support network, this really does provide an opportunity for social connectedness. So a quote here I've included was from my doctoral research, which I completed the year before last. And one older lady, when she was talking about having lived with her daughter since giving up driving, stated, "I don't see them both as much anymore because they've moved out. So at least I get to see them when they come to get me to go shopping or whatever it is that we do." Another positive outcome of using informal support is that it is a far more comfortable option than using public transport. And again, I've just talked about the problems older people have with public transport. And finally, older people tell us that when you actually have a lift with somebody else, you're able to get support with your shopping and even support if you've got difficulty with your mobility, such as getting in and out of the car. So it's a more tailored type of transport for older people. However, as with everything else, there's a negative side to using informal support as an alternative to driving in later life. So many people within my research, they talked about feeling like a burden on their family or their friends when they were using them for lifts to meet their own transport and mobility needs. So another one of my older participants, Penelope, she stated, "There are lots of times throughout the week where I may need a lift home from my sons after babysitting the children all day, particularly when it's getting late or it's dark and raining. But I won't ask for a lift because I know it would put him out and cause a lot of stress at home." So this feeling of being a burden, which actually is a barrier to many older people to ask for informal support. So it acts as a complete and utter barrier. So many older people won't even ask or receive lifts from others. There's also a feeling of guilt from older people when they do use alternative informal support. So feeling guilty about the busy lives of their family and friends, feeling guilty that they're putting an extra stress upon them in their busy lives. Other findings, negative findings that people have talked about, is feeling that you are on other people's time. So when you have a lift with other people, it's not about your needs and when you want to go, you're actually fitting into other people's routines and busy lifestyles. So it removes the independence and let that level of autonomy which driving provides. Informal support also reduces levels of spontaneity and choice. For example, if an older person normally shops in one particular supermarket, but the person that is giving them a lift goes to another supermarket, then they substitute their own preference just to go and have a lift and go wherever it is that the person driving needs to go. And finally, another negative outcome, informal support as an alternative to driving reduces overall the level of mobility needs which people have being met. For example, older people, especially once they've retired, often enjoy discretionary travel. Things such as driving for the sake of it, to see scenery, to see nature, what Dr. Charles Musselwhite refers to as the term biophilia. It's being in nature, which is good for your soul. But when you give up driving and you're reliant upon informal support, that often reduces these kind of social discretionary needs that you have. Now, the people who I interviewed did talk about a number of coping mechanisms that they employ to use informal support, if that is the alternative that they are using once they give up driving. So many people in my study talked about reciprocation as an alternative. So when they receive lifts or transport, if a family or friend perhaps purchases goods and delivers them to them on their behalf, they often feel like they need to reciprocate that help and support. So they may offer money, they may buy gifts, they may express high levels of gratefulness and gratitude to the support provider. Something else that older people do is trip claim. So for example, if an older person is having a lift in the car of a neighbour and they need to get to a hospital for an appointment, for example, they may ask that neighbour if they would mind swinging by the supermarket whilst they are already out, whilst they are visiting a hospital. So what that does is reduce the amount of times that that older person or the neighbour would have to take the older adult to the supermarket or to the hospital. If you get it done in one trip, it kind of makes things a lot easier then by combining the trip. Something else which was really interesting to come out of my study is that older people actually ration support amongst those that provide the support to them. So what that means is they utilise a number of different people in their informal support network to meet their transport and mobility needs. So they may ask, for example, a neighbour to take them shopping. They may ask a daughter to take them to bingo if that's what they want to do. Or they may ask a friend to take them into town if they just want a social trip. So a quote here again from one of the older ladies in my study sums this up. And she stated, I try and ask both my daughters to take it in turns to take me food shopping or into town, whatever. I also try and pick things up when I'm with friends, if we are out and about. That saves the girls taking me. Otherwise, that is when the stress starts. So what Alice, my older participant, was referring to is the levels of stress which she notices amongst her adult daughters who are her primary informal support providers. So she tries to do things to minimise that level of stress which is felt. So just to sum up today's presentation then, it has been a kind of short summary of some of the research which I have done. But overall, what we've learned is that driving in later life is linked to high levels of well-being and life satisfaction. However, many older people will and do have to face giving up driving in later life due to personal and wider social influences. So we've talked about things such as poor eyesight and hearing and different things that go wrong as we age, as well as wider social influences which can actually hinder older drivers. When somebody gives up driving, it is associated with detrimental impacts upon well-being and quality of life. So things like depression, loneliness, and isolation, unfortunately. Informal support, so transport that is provided by people in an older person's informal support network, is a partial alternative. However, this is not a complete alternative to one driving in later life. Informal support works best when it is actually used alongside other modes of transport. For example, if an older person uses informal support sometimes, but also uses the bus, or perhaps walks if they're able to meet some of the mobility needs, they are the older people that normally have the best outcomes once they give up driving. And to sum up, what policy and practice needs to do is address the needs of informal support providers. So for example, a family member, a friend or neighbour, they are also living quite busy, stressful lives with their own number of commitments that they have. So if policy and practice could help them in any way, that would be successful. For example, by introducing more flexible working policies to recognise that many people in society do have older people to support with their own transport and mobility needs. And what's also needed are improved alternatives to driving for older people. So things like improved public transport, more tailored services, new interventions, that sort of thing. So I know that my colleague who will be introducing his presentation next, Dr. Ian Shergold, he will be talking to you about some of these other alternatives to driving in later life. So there is a list of references. However, if anybody listening to the presentation wants any further information, please feel free to contact me. My email address is included on the first introductory slide, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ian Shergold. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Transport and Society at the University of West of England in Bristol. I'm going to be talking to you today about several projects that I've had involvement with over the last few years that have focused on smaller scale mobility solutions for older people. So what's the need that these solutions are looking to address? So in the UK, we're seeing a transition to an older society with an increase in the elderly population, and particularly those aged 80 and over. And as you can see from the population pyramid on the right-hand side of the screen here, this is a trend that's likely to continue to grow over the years through to 2050. And notwithstanding the increased use of car by all sectors of the population, including older people, there does come a time when older people are more likely to need to think about other modes of transport. And the normal choice, or the first default choice, is public transport when we think about that. But for some people, that's not a solution, and often it's health that will constrain their access to public transport. And to an extent, in recent decades here in the UK as well, we've seen a shrinking of public transport services, ones that are both state supported and ones which are commercially run. Transport, though, of course, is very important for out-of-home mobility. We've heard that in the other presentations today. The ability to visit shops, to buy food, to visit healthcare services, or to attend events, as we might describe them, is determined then by the availability of both affordable and accessible transport that goes to the places that older people need to go to, when they need to go to them as well. And they have to be services that are accessible both physically, but also the services that are usable to older people. And I'd just point out the increasing use of digital and mobile-based technologies in transport in recent years, things like digital ticketing and travel information services. And for some old people, this is a barrier, a digital divide, which they're not comfortable with, and which may preclude them using transport like this.
Thank you
mass transit's not the answer.
for your introductions.
We need something that's more flexible and smaller scale, perhaps, something more appropriate. Now, the obvious choice here would be something like a taxi, and this can be a solution, but it's often seen to be too expensive, or a solution that's not favoured by older people. There are security and safety concerns for some people, particularly older women. More generally, transport is normally an afterthought. It's normally something you think about after you've decided you're going to make a journey, you're going to go somewhere, or you're going to be involved in some form of event. And it's often arranged separately to the trip or to the event. And this might mean that if actually sorting out the transport is too difficult or expensive, then people don't make that journey, they don't attend the event. And the result of this, of course, could be negative in terms of social inclusion, in terms of isolation, and in terms of older people's well-being more generally. So just looking then quickly at a couple of trial solutions that have been looked at in my home city of Bristol in the UK. So the first is something that was called My First Mile. It was a shared taxi service. And it was operating in an area that was really quite poorly served by public transport. There were public transport routes on either side of this residential neighbourhood, but nothing actually running within the neighbourhood itself. So if you didn't have a car, you had a fairly significant walk to get to a public transport route. The service was initially aimed at commuters in peak periods, and then extended to serve primarily an older population outside of commute times. And what it did was reconnect them to the city's bus network. So as I say, it was a scheduled shared taxi service. People could get it from some recognized stops, or they could book a journey if they had the means to do so. And towards the end of the trial, we were actually allowing people just to flag the taxi down as it came past. Everyone paid the same fare, and older people actually could travel free because they could use their concessionary public transport pass on it. So that was quite a successful service, and just allowed us to test out whether this sort of service would work. The second program that we looked at was something called WeGo, and again was taxi based, and again a shared service. And the way this one worked was it was demand led. So it was looking at where people would go for an event. In this case, we were looking at activities happening at a health centre, and it would collect up all the people going to one particular class and take them to the health centre. So it used some other technology in the background, algorithms to work out the optimum routes and so on and so forth. The people who used it, who were primarily older people, were really enthusiastic about the service. They really enjoyed using it. The event of traveling itself became a social occasion and helped a lot of people to overcome issues of isolation, because it got them out of the house. It took them somewhere with a group of people who were going to the same event. So a really good illustration of how a demand-led service can actually provide real benefits for older people. And in surveys we did of users, we discovered that some people wouldn't actually attend events if it hadn't been for the service, and they'd like to use it for a lot more. Unfortunately, this one was curtailed because of the COVID outbreak and the lockdowns that followed. So some of these pilots have been really interesting, really useful, really well liked, but there are still some issues with this idea of shared mobility. And it goes back to some of the reasons that people don't like using taxis. And it seems there's an even stronger dislike of sharing with strangers, although we overcame that with the people going to the events at the health centre. And these issues are likely to be more important for the older so people who are 80 plus, which is a particularly fast growing sector of that group in the UK. And of course, post-COVID, we've got some additional issues to think about around sharing spaces with people, which is going to take some time to get over. Just finally then, I just want to briefly look at a couple of other projects that I've also been involved in the last couple of years around autonomous driverless vehicles, one of which was a study of how we might use such a vehicle in a retirement complex, a retirement village here in the city of Bristol. So we were looking at self-driving shuttles that have the potential to provide these small-scale flexible solutions. The benefit, well, one benefit being you don't need a driver. So they can provide independence for older people in general, and also help those who don't have access or who are no longer able to drive to regain some mobility as well. I say we undertook some trials in a retirement village back in 2019, and there are other trials happening all around the world. And potentially this could be the future of demand-led mobility. One thing to think about, though, is that when we carried out our study, one of the things we were really interested in was what would people use such vehicles for? And what came across was that people weren't thinking about using them for journeys like shopping or healthcare, the necessary journeys, if you like. They were really interested in whether they could get to things that they were missing now: cultural activity, the arts, cinema, museums, etc., visit to the countryside or to the seaside, or family trips, or to go on holiday. So lots of journey purposes that perhaps are the more discretionary types of travel. So it was really interesting finding to see how people thought they might use these vehicles in the future. Anyway, that's a very, very brief just look at some smaller, more flexible, perhaps demand-led solutions that we might be thinking about as we go forward in thinking about how we best provide mobility to older people who don't drive, and those that we would encourage not to drive, perhaps for other reasons such as climate change. So thank you very much for your attention, and by all means send me any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Charles Musselwhite, Dr. Amy, Dr. Ian for sharing their findings from UK. A gentle reminder, please type your questions in the chat box for any of our available speakers to address in the chat box. If time permits, we will have a face-to-face or virtual session after Dr. Takio's presentation. So our last speaker in this international session is Dr. Takio Ogawa. Dr. Takio Ogawa is the President, Specific Non-Profit Organization Asian Aging Business Center, Project Manager for Preventive Long-Term Care Promotion Project in Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, and Modeling Human Development and Long-Term Care Workforce. He's also the Emeritus Professor for 2 universities in Japan, Yamaguchi University and Kyushu University. Dr. Takio Ogawa has several publications which includes Aging in Asia Pacific, Interdisciplinary and Comparative Perspective, Beyond the Trance of Uroshima Taro, Changing Social Concepts of Age Towards the Active Senior Citizens in changes social concepts of age towards the active senior citizens. Without much ado, let's welcome Dr. Takio Ogawa to share about age-friendly mobility and transportation lessons from Japan. Over to you, Dr. Takio Ogawa.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to present in this meaningful webinar. I will talk about the Japanese experiences of age-friendly mobilities and transportation. At first, I will prospect population aging in Asia. The horizontal axis is a percentage of ratio of under 4 years old in total population. The vertical axis is a percentage of ratio of over 65 years old in total population. If country located on the right bottom, it means these countries are young society. On the contrary, a country which located on the left top in these figures, it means super aged society. According with the vertical axis, a country which have 7% over aged population shall be called as aging societies. Until 14%, countries are called as aged societies. Furthermore, over 21% countries shall be called as super aged society. Japan is already super aged society since 2006. In 2025, near futures, Malaysia shall be located on phase of aging society. In 2050, almost the East Asian countries shall be a phase of super aged society. Malaysia shall be reached in an aged society, and other Asian countries also shall reach in aging society phase. Therefore, in order to prepare the next phase, Asian countries should learn from Japan's past challenges. During 1970 to 1994, Japan was an aging society. Next, 1995 to 2005, Japan was an aged society. And after 2006, Japan is a super aged society. According with these population aging progresses, issues of the mobility and plantations have shifted its focus. In accordance with the population aging, the challenges of supporting the mobility for the elderly emerged increasingly. However, the approaches of mobility support varies from policymakers to policymakers. In Japan, central ministry and agencies were reorganized in 2001. The Ministry of Health and Welfare was integrated with the Ministry of Labor and became the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare. The Ministry of Constructions and the Ministry of Transportations and the National Land Agencies were integrated into the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transports, and Tourism. The Ministry of Home Affairs, including national police agencies, and the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications were integrated into the Ministries of Internal Affairs and Communications. These ministries are involved in mobility and transportation policies. This slide introduced the main initiatives of the Japanese ministries and business involved in mobility support historically. In the field of social welfare, various auxiliary equipment has been devised to support the mobility for the elderly and people with disabilities. Canes, wheelchairs, electric wheelchairs, moving lifts, etc. In 1972, automakers began selling cars for people with disabilities. On respect for the aged day, September 15 at the time, in 1973, the Japan National Railways set up the priority seats for the elderly and people with disabilities called as silver seats. Furthermore, in 1973, a welfare equipment exhibition was held, and various mobility support devices for the elderly and people with disabilities were widely introduced in. In addition to personal self-help equipment, we are now in an era where technological innovations in the mobility supports are promoted, such as ambient assisted livings and smart housings and age-friendly mobility and transportation. During this aging society phase, Japan achieved high economic growth, but realized the needs to take on new challenges to the aging of the population. Japan's population aging is positively correlated with urbanization. During the periods of rapid economic growth, many young people moved to large cities. Then older persons were left behind in rural and regional cities. Municipalities where young people have left were aging and depopulating rapidly. Not saying these depopulated areas, the Diet enacted Depopulating Area Act that moderated the regional disparities with urban areas. When the Depopulation Areas Act came into force in 1970, municipalities designed as depopulating areas were already in the midst of the depopulation. It was from the Depopulating Area Act on 1990 that the issues of the population's aging or the elderly in the depopulating areas was focused on as a policy. And it seems to include measures to support the elderly who were left behind in the depopulated areas and became vulnerable to mobility and transportation. Many elderly people remained in depopulating areas. However, due to the declining population, bus companies would be not able to maintain the route. Therefore, measures were taken to maintain the bus routes in depopulating areas to support the mobility of all elderly residents. However, these measures will be reviewed sooner or later because of the heavy financial burden. And in many depopulated areas, traffic vacancies areas have been generated. Furthermore, the problems of the mobility support became an issues in urbanized city also. Therefore, improvements of the barrier-free mobility environments were promoted as a policy in public facilities and public transportation. From the aging society phase to the aged society phase, private car were rapidly increased, spreading in Japan. However, when Japan enters in the aging society phase, the number of buses became a tendency of almost equilibrium states or the slight decrease. At the super aged society phase, the spread of the private cars will also slow down because of the decrease of the total populations, especially the decrease in the number of new drivers, or the suspensions of the operations of the elderly drivers, etc. Then MLIT, which controlled the Transportation Administration, took considerations of the residents' mutual activities of the mobility support by the sharing the private car use. In depopulating areas, NPOs, non-profit organizations, developed activities such as paid alternative transportation support. Also, the paid alternative transportation support for the disabled and the frail elderly were started by NPO since 2004. In addition, at the stage of the aged society, mobility support for the people living in the houses on slopes appears as a policy challenge not only in the depopulated areas, but also in urban areas. In Nagasaki City, for example, in 1997, open door elevators and escalators were installed for residents living in houses on slopes. Taxi companies in Nagasaki also began an attempt to provide a service in which taxi drivers would pick up and drop off from driveway to house on slope. Thus, From the end of the aging society stage, so-called barrier-free installations was promoted in the public facilities where a lot of people gathered, braille block for the visual impaired, the step cancellations for the elderly, the toilets for the persons with disabilities, the elevators and the escalators for the mobility supports for the elderly persons and the persons with disabilities. It was a challenge of the former Ministry of the Constructions, which was in the place of the building standards. In 1994, a law was enacted for promoting barrier-free. Since 2000, the mobility environments of the public facility was improved significantly. Later, the Ministry of Construction was integrated with the Ministry of Transport. And this project was also integrated with the law called the Transportation Barrier-Free Act of the Ministry of Transport into the new Barrier-Free Act. The former Ministry of Transport has followed the former Ministry of the Construction in enforcing the Traffic Barrier-Free Act and promote barrier-free public transportation, railways, ships, aircraft, buses, etc. These were targeted. For passengers cars, a car that can put people with disability was developed in 1972 and in 1998. A taxi company that started operating as a welfare taxi appears. Here is a list of the most recent barrier-free targets 2019 goals and 2025 goals. The following three slides show the goals for reaching and the next categories such as railways, buses, taxis, ships, aircraft, roads, parks, parking lots, buildings, traffic signals, plannings, and enlightenments of the mind barrier-free. Welfare taxi or assisted taxis are shown in the last columns of this page. This slide shows the barrier-free access to the ships, airlines, roads, and parks. This slide shows the barrier-free point of reach for parking lots, buildings, and traffic lights, as well as the next goals. And in addition, it includes municipalities' initiatives for plannings and the MLIT enlightenments of barrier-free of the mind. This is a new strategy. In Japan, which is entering the super aged society stage, it's no longer enough to provide mobility support for the elderly as traffic vulnerable peoples. As you can see in this slide, the rate of the fatal accidents involving elderly drivers has gradually increased. In terms of the physical agility and the accuracies of cognitive functions, the ability of the elderly to live in daily life is reduced. It's more prone to accident, and the risk of not only being victims to the elderly themselves, but also all the persons maybe become perpetrators who create many victims increasingly. In recent years, traffic accidents among the elderly have attracted attentions, and the national policy agencies has been promoting the voluntary returns of the driver's licenses, particularly for the elderly drivers over the age of 75. It's mandatory to conduct tests to check the normality of the physical agility and cognitive functions at the time of license renewal. As a result, if there is a risk of dementia, etc., they shall have to consult a medical doctors. If they are diagnosed with dementia, they will not be able to renew their license. Elder people who return their driver license will be left in the states where mobility support is needed. Taxi tickets may be temporarily distributed for them, but they are not permanent. Some municipalities offer discount tickets for the public bus use, but last 1 mile mobility support from bus stop to their home shall be issued. If older persons are left in a difficult to move state, IADL or ADL cognitive functions, etc. will decrease, and the risk of needed supports and long-term care conditions increase. This slide shows the decline of in the IADL and the ADL for the elderly in need of support as relieved by the long-term care insurance system. It can be seen that the shopping difficulties are the beginnings of the support and long-term care requirements. Shopping difficulties are related with mobility difficulties. In support super age society phase, the number of elderly people who have fallen into mobility difficulties is increasing. It has become clear that the mobility support in response to these situations cannot be handled only by the providing service by existing public sectors, market sectors, and personal ownership. Therefore, many people are interested in the ideas of the alternative sharing communities. As a result of the revisions of the long-term care insurance systems, non-profit organizations, neighboring communities have provide mobility support services, including pickup and drop-off between home to daycare centers and or shopping centers. Under the comprehensive programs of preventive long-term care and life support in a community-based integrated care system. Non-profit organizations exploring transportation as a club assets, so to speak, such as mobility support in traffic vacancy areas and the mobility support activities for people with disabilities and elderly peoples in need of long-term care. MLIT, which is in control of transportation administrations, has also revised the law to respond to such movements. Let's summarize the above said experience of Japan's initiatives. In the figures of the slide, the horizontal axis shows a difference between the casework or population approach to mobility support. The vertical axis shows the difference between developments of equipments or human services. Japan's mobility support began with activity to procure self-help equipment and auxiliary equipment. This means that it started with the quadrant in the upper left. At the aging society phase, priority seats for the elderly and cars that are easy to drive appears, and the welfare equipment exhibition introducing various mobility support devices. This was an effort located in the right upper quadrant. In order to support these developments, the government had developed laws and issued support measures. In the aged society phase, it had decided to respond not only to hardware improvements, but also to human support through the public long-term care insurance system. This means that we have moved to the lower right quadrant. Today, Japan in a super aged phase is challenging for the supporting mobility not only for the elderly and people with disabilities, but also for all generations. That means it has moved to the lower left quadrant. Please learn from Japanese experiences for innovating more effective age-friendly mobility and transportation for all generations and countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Takio Ogawa, for sharing the lessons from Japan regarding age-friendly mobility. These lessons are very useful to us for benchmarking. This brings us to the end of the international session, and I would like to pass over to Prof. Dr. Hayati.